Good morning, it's 9 o'clock and welcome to Syngenta's virtual meeting. We were really hoping to do a face-to-face, but we took the gamble of taking a virtual meeting instead, and it looks like that might have been quite a useful thing. But just before I go through the agenda today, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. And just to let everyone know that this webinar is going to be recorded, so just bear that in mind if you're going to offer any questions up, because that will be captured in the recording. And with the questions, please send them to me as the host, and I will pick those up using the Q&A box, and I will sort of bring those into the presentation at the end. We can ask those. And just to remind you that basis and Noroso points are available for this webinar. You'll get all the details in an email following to apply for those points, and also a link to a feedback form, which we'd really appreciate any feedback we get, as we sort of like to act on that quite all the time. And then just going through what we're going to talk about today. So Tracy is going to pick up at the beginning, and we're going to look at a market update for spring barley. And over the past few seasons, there's probably been quite a change of the amount of growers looking at spring barley, simply because of the weather conditions we've had. But this year has been quite a nice autumn, so we'll see how that may be reflected in the update. Obviously, we're going to talk about key varieties with Catherine. We're looking at Laureate, Tungsten, and Splendor, and advice for 2022, and then we'll have a bit of an overview on some agronomics for spring barley, looking at PGR, fungicide options, and then also grassweed controls with me and Georgie. And then really interesting at the end, we're going to go back to Catherine, and she's going to show us some of the trials work around carbon footprints that we've been doing in the East over the last few years. So without further ado, I'll move on to Tracy so she can start with the market update.
Thank you very much, Matt. So good morning, everybody. So my name is Tracy Creasy, and we're going to have a quick look, start this webinar looking at the market for spring barley this season. So if we look at the spring barley market for the previous year, so harvest 21, we can see a very strong performance from two varieties in particular. So Laureate and RGT Planet have been the mainstay for the last couple of years of the UK market. Laureate really taking a very strong foothold in replacing Concerto in Scotland, but a really strong position here in the East as well. So I've split these certified seed figures into blue for England and the green is Scotland, but you can see a really good performance and uptake of Laureate as the biggest variety within the UK, but very good and firm foothold here in England. Of course, there's a lot of smaller varieties within the portfolio mix of varieties that were in the ground for harvest 21. So the old Prepino, one of our favourite varieties, beginning to be outclassed and removing from the market now. But we can see our two new varieties, SY Tungsten and SY Splendor, coming into the certified seed levels, and Kath will talk about them as we go through. So as from a Syngenta position, we have a strong market share uptake in terms of certified seed and farm safe, and this really supports us in our Syngenta Malting Barley Excellence campaign and activity going forward. But what does that mean on farm in England? We can see if we break the certification figures down into England only, that there is slightly more Planet there was last year in England than Laureate. But what we can see if we look at the maltster uptake, so the graph on the right shows the maltster purchases from England. And we can see that the dominant spring barley from maltsters purchased in England is Laureate. Yes, there is a lot of Planet there, but a lot of that's going for into the feed market and potentially on the black grassland where it's more difficult to grow wheat now. But we can see that the maltsters really do want Laureate, and one of the reasons why that is because it's a dual purpose variety, so it gives them options to go for the brewing or the malt distilling market. Now, what does 2022 look like? It's a very difficult one to call. We know that the early bird survey from AHDB and DEFRA came out, and has a provisional forecast of the winter wheat area for this harvest being at 1.81 million hectares. So we've had that big open autumn, as Matt's just alluded to, which has driven wheat sowings going into the ground. A good winter barley area as well means that that autumn area is bigger than it has been, and it was bigger than it was originally predicted. And so that asks the question of what will be the spring barley area, what land is left for spring barley for 2022. And the early bird forecast predicts 688,000 hectares. Now, talking to the end users and talking to the contracts that are out there, we actually think there'll be more than that. The contracts will be key this spring, but we need around a 700,000 hectare spring barley market. And so I think it'll be a bit more than that, but it depends on how much wheat has gone in the last week or two, but we will see that. But I think contracts will be key this spring. So if you're growing spring barley and you're a traditional spring barley grower, you've probably already got your contracts in place. But we'll look for contracts this spring, and we are going to talk to you about managing your crop the best way to be able to meet the specifications so that your crop will be accepted for the maltsters. Now, talking to maltsters, if we look at the NBC approved list, so this is the update that came out at the end of November, and it remains unchanged from last year. So in the winter sector, we have Flagencraft and Electrum in the winter brew market. But if we look at the springs, which you're looking at now, and look at our varieties, Syngenta, we can see that Laureate remains the approved variety for brewing and malt distilling. We have got Fairing in as a grain distill variety approved, and traditionally that was originally in Scotland. There is some of that being grown in England, but predominantly it's a Scottish grain distill variety. And then we have SY Tungsten and SY Splendor. So Tungsten provisionally approved for brewing and malt distilling, and Splendor provisionally approved for brewing. And Catherine will talk to you about those in a minute. Now, very aware that the new recommended list has come out, and if we look at the spring barleys on the recommended list, we see a relatively good list in terms of number of varieties on there. We have a new variety called SY Bronte, which sits here. But one of the key things I think for the list and for the UK in terms of end users' requirements and growers' needs is SY Tungsten, which remains the highest yielding dual purpose variety. So there are maltsters out there that will not take the brew onlys now, and that's more difficult for the likes of Planet and Propino, etc. So we're looking as a breeding company, the dual purposes are the real varieties that the UK requires, and Tungsten remains the highest yielding of those varieties. I did say we've got SY Bronte. So SY Bronte is a new brew option for the UK. So like Propino and Planet, it comes in for that brew market. I'm not going to talk much about it today because it will be a seed trade launch this year and first year on farm next year. Unless you're a seed grower. But it does bring a really nice package to the UK. So although some of the maltsters are moving to dual purpose, some of them will take the brews, and you can still see that with Planet. And yield and brew performance is key for those varieties. And we have SY Bronte here, which has shown strong, consistent yields. It's got good grain and straw characteristics and a very high hot water extract for the brew market. And you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, UK performance is good, but it has a particularly good eastern and west performance. So the brew market for the UK. And then just one look at the new recommended list candidates supporting us coming forward in our pipeline. SY Tennyson, a dual purpose, very high yielding dual purpose. It's the highest yielding variety out there. SY Dual, another dual purpose, and SY Signet, which is a brew variety for the UK. So just a little look at what we have got coming. Just showing that we continue with our Syngenta malting barley expertise, really delivering, listening to what growers and end users require and delivering for the market. So today we are going to mainly talk about the varieties that will be on farm this spring. Obviously there'll be a lot of people looking at Laureate, continuing to grow Laureate and potentially putting more Laureate in. So we're going to look at the best how to get the best and why to continue to believe in Laureate going forward. But we're also going to have a look at the two new varieties, SY Tungsten and SY Splendor, and they will be a significant proportion of the UK this spring. And without further ado, I hand over to Kath.
Okay, morning everybody. So thanks to Tracy for that overview of the market going into 2022. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the three major varieties from Syngenta, Laureate, Tungsten and Splendor. So if we start with Laureate, as Tracy's already mentioned, this is the #1 spring barley for the whole of the UK. So a true dual purpose variety. It has full approval for both brewing and malt distilling. And in the past, varieties have had full approval for both these markets, but haven't necessarily always managed to perform in both of these markets, whereas Laureate really does perform. It is a great all-rounder. It performs on the farm and it also performs with all of the end users, which is why it is one of the most, well, it is the most popular spring malting barley for the UK. So it's accepted by pretty much every major maltster out of there. It's got really nice agronomics, really high untreated yield, and good disease resistance, and the high demand means that it's a nice secure variety in terms of saleability at the end of the crop. So if we have a look at its performance this year, really Laureate is incredibly consistent. It's and reliable. It always does what it's supposed to do in every region. It has been high yielding and consistent yielding around about the 102 mark. And this year, the graph on the left-hand side shows you the 5-year treated mean along the bottom, and then the 2021 treated yield up the vertical axes. And you can see Laureate has performed very well from 2021 trials, a little bit above its a 5-year average. So very consistent in terms of yield across the regions and across the years. If we look at how it's performed over the years in terms of yield, so Laureate was recommended in 2016, and for the first 3 years when it was recommended, Laureate and Planet sort of vied for that top spot, that highest yielding spot. 1 year Laureate would be the top yielding, then it would be Planet. But actually over the years, what we've seen is a very strong, consistent yield from Laureate. It has continued to maintain that yield, and actually where other varieties have started to decline slightly, as you would expect over years, Laureate has really continued to maintain. Planet now on the list, you can see it's down in the 90s, whereas Laureate is still 102. And actually this year there's about half a ton difference between yield between these two varieties. So Laureate still maintaining that very high yield. Now, if we look at it compared to one of the newer varieties, so LG Diablo, which was recommended 2 years after Laureate, Diablo, like a lot of new varieties, came in at the top, #1 yielding variety, but very quickly actually it came back down to sort of it dropped quite quickly after the year. And this is not a mean, this is the annual yields. And so you can see that first year it was recommended, did very well, and actually now the year after and the year after that, very similar to Laureate. And again, 2022 RL data shows that Laureate is actually the higher of the two. So again, showing that Laureate really is able to maintain that very good, consistent yield over the years, even though it's now been on the recommended list for 7 years. So having a look at its agronomics, as I mentioned before, Laureate is is a nice clean variety. Most varieties generally join the recommended list with a high untreated yield, and then as you get more and more data, that untreated yield tends to drop depending on whether you've had a high disease year or a low disease year. But Laureate has been one of the top untreated yields for the last 7 years. It really has maintained that, and it shows its very good resistance package. So it has MLA resistance for mildew, brown rust is a solid 5, and Rhynchosporium is also 5.1. Rhyncho has been hard to come by in previous years. This year we have had quite a lot of Rhynchosporium in the untreated trials, and that's split up the differences between the varieties quite significantly this year. So that Rhyncho rating of a 5 is very, very good. There's only a couple of varieties that have a Rhyncho rating higher. When we look at the straw strength, I think we've always known that Laureate, one of its weaknesses is the straw strength for the lodging resistance. Brackling resistance is good, but lodging is a little bit weaker than some of the other varieties out there. So we've always said we should consider a PGR program would be needed on this variety. And Georgie will go through PGR considerations later on today, considering very much weather conditions and adapting to the season. Ripening is a +1, and that sits in between sort of the other two varieties, the big varieties of RGT Planet and LG Diablo, which is a bit later at a +2. So speaking now a little bit about the two markets that Laureate can go for. As I said, it is a true dual purpose variety. It is very much taken by end users for both brewing and malt distilling. Now, these two markets do require slightly different grain nitrogen in particular. So for your brewing, this is domestic brewing, so not for export. We're looking at around about 1.65 to 1.8%. And what we've done over the past, well, quite a few years now, we've been looking at nitrogen trials and looking at both yield and grain nitrogen. We've looked at different splits, and we've also looked at rate, and this is the results from the rate trials from the last 3 years versus the other dual purpose variety of LG Diablo. So what we can see is that we've taken a range from 125 up to 175. I am very, very aware of the price of nitrogen at the moment. The reason we go quite high is not necessarily because people will be looking at those kind of rates, but actually we're trying to sort of break where that highest nitrogen really is. You know, we're not necessarily saying you should go that high, but we're trying to sort of break it in a trial situation. What we can see is that Laureate, your yields are increasing, even up to that 175 kilos, but realistically, we're not getting a very high, a big increase in yield. And actually, our grain nitrogens are continuing to increase. So we're not getting a dilution with that higher yield, we're still getting high grain N. Now we're at around about nearly up to 101.75% at this point. In a very, very high nitrogen year, that would be well over the 1.8%, and therefore not really getting you that brewing specification for your premiums. So what we're saying here is that high nitrogen is not needed to boost yield, and actually, you know, you're able to get the grain specification for brewing easily with a reduced rate. For the malt distilling contracts, and there might be some of these available in the East, because many maltsters will be looking for high and low grain N contracts across England in order to support the Scottish market. We are looking at a much lower grain N, so we're looking at below 1.65% grain N. So the rates that we've chosen, again, we're looking at from 100 to up to 150. And what we're seeing really, again, we are seeing a yield increase, but we're getting very close to that 1.65% limit. This is an average of 3 years as well. And then some years we went over that limit by going up to the 150. So our advice really is a starting point of around 100 to 125 kilos of N. Obviously, this will be very dependent on normal practice for your own farms. But what we're sort of saying here is that what we aren't seeing is with an increased yield, we're getting a dilution. What we're seeing is increased rates is increasing the grain N as well. So just a quick summary for Laureate. It is the biggest spring barley variety across the UK. There are contracts available for both brewing and malt distilling, so high and low contracts. Check locally for what your local maltster would prefer. Yield is incredibly consistent, and the untreated yield is still very high after 7 years. This is a point for anybody who is looking to do some trials on their own. Don't use Laureate for fungicide trials because you won't get very good results. And there are continued demand for this variety from all of the end users. And so we see that Laureate will continue to be a very, very big variety for the coming years. We look now to SY Tungsten. So this is our new variety, also dual purpose. It currently has provisional MBC approval for brewing and malt distilling. So Tungsten was recommended in 2020. After that, it then goes through large scale testing through the end users, the maltsters, the brewers, and the distillers. And so that will take a couple more years before we get full approval by the MBC. Currently, it has done its first year and it's in its final year of testing. So full MBC approval for both markets is possible this June. And so we are awaiting results for that. And we've got first indications that are very positive. So we're really hopeful that we'll get the full MBC approval this summer. Now, of course, what that does mean is that at the moment, if you are thinking of planting tungsten this spring, you are not guaranteed to get sort of the full premiums for it because it isn't fully MBC approved. So our advice again this year is really stay with an approved variety for the majority of the spring barley that you're growing, unless you have a specific contract or a seed contract for those varieties that are not yet full approved. So just a little bit more of a breakdown of the new recommended list for you. I've highlighted the only 3 varieties that have approval for both the brewing and the malt distilling. So you can see there are only Tungsten, LG Diablo, and Laureate. Diablo and Laureate have the full approval, and Tungsten has provisional at the moment. All of the new varieties that have just been recommended are either brew onlys or feed varieties, and CB score has been added to the descriptive list as a special quality variety. So of the 3 varieties that have that dual purpose potential, SY Tungsten is the top yielding of those, and it has maintained that now for the last 3 years. It's got very good straw, nice stiff straw, so 7.2 for resistance to lodging and a 7.6 for brackling. And what we've seen in previous years when we've got some good lodging results, PGR results, is that it has a really good response to PGRs. So we looked at seed rate trials, and when you added PGR on top, we got no brackling at that point. And so really nice straw agronomics with SY Tungsten. And it's earlier maturing than both Diablo and Laureate. So a +1, so it's the same rating as Laureate, but if you look at that in terms of where they all sit in their rankings, you can see that Fairing by far and away the earliest maturing variety. And then there are quite a few varieties that are classed as 0 or +1. Tungsten's highlighted there green. It's earlier than Laureate and also LG Diablo. Planet, as I said, a little bit earlier, but a really nice maturity, and that really does allow that earlier harvest in difficult weather conditions, which we all saw this harvest, and that's really vital for the quality crops to try and get it in earlier and really maintain that quality in the grain. So as I said before, the Rhynchosporium is more prevalent in 2021 than it was in 2022, and so all of the varieties have seen a drop in their rating. Now that is not because the resistance rating has reduced, it's because there is just a far more Rhyncho around, and so we've been able to pull out the differences between the varieties far more. Tungsten, unfortunately, has never been particularly strong on Rhynchosporium, but that rating is now down to a 3, and that's definitely where we would recommend any sort of fungicide programs to be targeted at, which Matt and Georgie will come into later. High specific weight, so that's a great improvement on both Laureate and Diablo, and a really good hot water extract, which gives you a good indication of the alcohol content. So then quickly now, if we just move on to the next slide, Kim, please. Oh, okay, so again, we're talking about the ability of tungsten to be able to go for both markets. Again, we're looking at being able to get a low grain N and high grain N for the malt distilling and the brewing markets. And the trials that we've conducted over the last couple of years, we have seen that tungsten is easily able to make those specifications for both markets just by tailoring the rate. So easily able to make both the high and the low nitrogen for those different markets. So it's a strong fit for both the markets. High hot water extract, which indicates strong alcohol yield for brewing, and a good PSY for malt distilling. Really strong specific weight, and it's got the ability to be able to make both markets in terms of the quality required. It's got stiff straw and really strong yields in all regions. So in the east, it's good, and other regions, it's also high yields across the board. So we hope to get full approval for both the markets in June 2022. So very quickly, we'll just talk about Splendor. So SY Splendor is our brew only variety. It joined the recommended list at the same time as SY Tungsten in 2020, and it has provisional approval for MBC for brewing. So it's in the same position as Tungsten. It's completed its first stage of large scale testing, and it has a final year this year. Again, potential to get the brewing full approval in June 2022. So again, exactly the same as Tungsten. It doesn't have full approval yet. So if you are looking at trying out Splendor, we would recommend that you stick with a fully approved variety such as Laureate for the majority of the crop, and then just try smaller amounts of those that haven't yet been fully approved. It's a really, really good option for the East as well, because it's got great specific weight, high yields, and excellent straw strength. So it's a really secure agronomic combination. And if you do have blackgrass, this will also help in that situation of suppressing any grass weeds that you have. So if you're looking to get a higher N, or you're looking to put high nitrogen on in order to cause more suppression, then Splendor will definitely be able to cope with that, because it's got really, really good resistance lodging, and it's got one of the highest brackling resistance as well there. So it's also got the high specific weight, so also protects the grain quality from nutrient competition with weeds. And because it's got that provisional approval, there is potentially more market options in 2022. Oh, can you just click those? So just a quick summary then. We've got the three varieties of Laureate, Tungsten, and Splendor. And now I'll move over to Matt and Georgie to take you through some of the agronomy.
Thanks, Kath. Really interesting update. So yeah, me and Georgie are just going to have a quick overview of some of the agronomic sort of focus for spring barley. But it's just nice to remind ourselves that spring barley is quite a diverse crop in terms of end markets. And with that sort of comes quite a complicated approach to sort of growing for those end markets, with some areas of that needing lesser nitrogen, potentially pushing nitrogen in others. And with both that, you're going to get potentially risks around lodging if you're pushing the nitrogen, and if you're pushing the crop canopy, obviously that's going to have an impact on things such as disease management as well. But just thinking about starting off, obviously the most important day of that seed is when it goes in the ground. And as you can probably imagine, the later we go through the year, the seed rates need to change to achieve what we look at as an optimal stand, which is 300 plants per square metre. And if you're sort of looking to establish around December time, you can see across all the varieties there, we're sort of recommending a seed rate of 325 seeds per square metre to achieve that 300 plant stand. And obviously consider factors locally, so whether you've got poor seed beds or just if there's lots of seed quality as well. But as you go later through the year, that seed rate needs to change, and this is all down to the fact obviously the time's running out for that plant to tiller out and create more heads come harvest, so that seed rate needs to adjust accordingly. So with that said, and thinking about plant stand, I'll pass on to Georgie just to look about canopy management.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so yeah, just having a quick think about that canopy management. The first thing I wanted to do is just highlight how different the last 5 seasons have been. So what we're looking at here is the weather anomaly maps for June, and they're highlighting where it's blue, we have seasons that have been wetter than the 30-year average, and where it's red, they've been drier. So over the last 5 years, in that June period, we've seen some really variable conditions, and that has such a big impact on the spring barley crop. Being a short season crop, the weather conditions really have such a great impact on the growth rate, also the availability of nitrogen, which obviously in turn can affect the lodging risk and also the quality, which Kath's also mentioned. So we know that where we have really dry seasons, the weather can act as a natural PGR. So that's why it's really important to adapt what we're doing to the season, rather than going out there with a specific plan at the beginning. So really need to think about adapting to those weather conditions. Particularly because preventing lodging is key for all crops, whether they're grown for yield or for those quality end markets. Lodging is potentially a big issue in terms of combine efficiency and quality of the end product as well. So we just have a look at a couple of seasons in particular. 2021 was a bit of a mixed bag across the country. So on the next slide, we've got the 2021 data. This is for Laureate, where we had a couple of different seed rates in this trial. And we're just looking at the impact of some different PGR programs. So we can see that using MODDUS at the T1 has given us some height reduction, which is really useful in reducing that lodging risk that we have. The Terpal at T2 also doing a good job, and the combination as well, providing the biggest reduction in height, particularly for that sort of lower seed rate crop there. Getting that early protection on is important if you think about how the weather conditions can change, and spraying timing availability later in the season can be difficult, particularly when those later PGRs do have particular cut-offs in terms of their growth stage for application and potential crop impacts if we go beyond those. So getting some early protection on is a bit of an insurance policy to make sure that we are protecting that crop from lodging risk from the first available opportunity. From there, if we have a look at 2017, which was a slightly wetter season generally across the board, this is where we saw some really good relationships between lodging and yield. So we can see that there's a seed rate impact here. As we've increased the seed rate, without any PGR, we have seen quite significant lodging in this trial. Where we've used a PGR program, we've reduced that significantly. And in this situation, we used a 0.1 of MODDUS at the early timing, and then followed that with an Ethafon chlormequat later on. So typically we'd be recommending up to 0.2 of MODDUS at that early timing. But again, as I said before, we really need to think about adapting those rates to the seasonal conditions. You can see that there's a really nice response in terms of yield as well. So where we've reduced that lodging, we have increased the yield. And as well as increasing yield, as I mentioned before, it's not just the out and out yield, but the efficiency of combining and the speed that you're able to do that. But also when these are quality crops, protecting that grain from any kind of spoilage by keeping the crop standing is a really important factor to consider too. So as I said before, just to kind of summarize, we do really need to be adapting to the season with those rates of PGR that we're using, remembering that if we do have really, really dry seasons, then the weather is acting as a natural PGR for us. So we do need to be a little more careful with those rates in those really dry seasons. But in general, getting some early protection on is a good way to go to have that insurance in place. So I'll now hand over to Matt to have a look at some of the fungicide work we've done.
Thanks, Georgie. And yeah, it's when we're applying PGRs, we're often sort of going at the same time with fungicides. So it's just nice to look at what value that fungicide programs deliver. And with spring barley, that can often clearly see here that over the last 5 years, We've got the red line on this chart that's looking at a fungicide spend of £50, and then you're sort of seeing the yield response over untreated. And over those 5 years, only 1 year really sort of just falls below what you would call a bit of a payback for that spend. But fungicide programs are an insurance-based policy, and looking at it over a long period of time really shows that investment in fungicides does pay across time. And this is looking at all varieties in the recommended list for those periods as well. And you can see there we've got the value of the grain when we were looking at this as well as a trial. The value of the grain was at £170 a tonne. So now at £200 a tonne, where we are at the moment, the economics certainly do sort of pay off with well-rounded fungicide programs. And also we're more used to in spring barley only sort of covering off a 2-spray program. In the winter, we can see here with a 3-spray program, we're contributing to yield throughout that program there with three stages. But in the spring, we can see that a good 2-spray program, obviously it's the timing, and the T2 is the main timing, which is delivering the biggest yield benefit. But you can see that we're nearly getting 40% of that yield drive at T1 timing as well. So it's still key to have a program rather than a one-shot approach. Now, Ramularia is a bit of a growing sort of focus. It's typically been known as the Scottish disease, but we can see it now coming across all parts of the country. And I think life after chlorothalonil is certainly driving that focus forward. So just a bit of a quick shot about looking at how to identify Ramularia, looking at the 5 R's of ID, which is the rectangular lesions. The lesions are always restricted by those leaf veins. They're reddish in colour. There's a nice chlorosis ring around that red colour that you see there, like a little halo. And you'll see that lesion also go right through the leaf. So that's always a good sort of short way of trying to remember how to identify for Ramularia. And also a lot of talk about Folpet at the moment. And Folpet tends to really be easily proved its benefit in barley over wheat, and particularly in spring barley. And we can see from some trials we carried out last year, just looking at Folpet improving the Ramularia control. And as you can see, we've got a program here with Siltra followed by Alatis, and then where we've added the Folpet in at the T2 timing, we've had a significant reduction in that Ramularia infected area. And then even as we mentioned before with the 2-spray program, a good focused 2-spray program, and adding Folpet into both of those parts of the program is also continuing that control nicely compared to some of the other new chemistry that's out there as well. And again, that can be shown in how it affects the yield. And that key 2 timing, this is looking at where we've added the Folpet. As you can see there, addition to Alatis, and then also adding it at T1 as well as T2, we're getting that dose response there from yield jumping up nearly half a ton, over half a ton by adding that Folpet in. And I think, again, the economics would justify adding Folpet in at both T1 and T2. And of course, adding to that resistant management as well, which is key. And here, just a nice few photos. Hopefully they come across well. You can see an untreated picture on the left where you can see the green area sort of disappearing. And then with just Alatis on its own, obviously you've had an improvement of that untreated and you're sort of at those sort of acceptable levels. But just by adding that Folpet in at that T2 timing, it can increase that green area considerably, which obviously is replicated in the yield and what we saw on those previous charts. And again, here, just comparing it to some of the new kids on the block, you see Alatis there with the addition of Folpet is certainly looking greener than a fairly sensible rate of Revistar at T2. And then just focusing more on Alatis area, and we talk about Brackling, and Kath's gone through the sort of Brackling scores for the varieties. But as we can see, again, that fungicide program is also delivering control with Brackling as well. And here we can see with Alatis, obviously you're getting an improvement on Brackling compared to an untreated, but where we've also included the Folpet in at the T2 here as well, that's also given a boost to that Brackling level as well. So just a summary of the sort of the spring barley recommendations. Now you can see I'll split it down into full program. If you've got the high risk area and you've got the net blotch or low disease, which in the east is always a possibility if you've got dry conditions, but we did look at the benefit of doing a 2-spray program, as obviously that T1 giving you that sort of 40% control, 40% addition to the yield. And you can see that T1 timing, just think about a prothioconazole SGHI, but include that Folpet where possible, and then going into the T2 with the Laureate, and we do recommend adding that Folpet as well to increase on both bracketing and disease control. And not to forget Georgina's messaging around PGRs, as you can see there, in using it at the T1 timing, around, Georgina mentioned 0.1 or 0.2, depending on the situation, and then following that up with an ethylene-based product at T2. So back to Georgina now to cover off some grass weeds.
Yes, so just to really quickly cover wild oat control, it's an issue that we've seen potentially increasing a little bit across the country over the last couple of years. So this trial is actually from last year. We put the products under some real pressure by applying them later than is actually allowed within their labels, but we wanted to do that to really push them and pull out the differences that we see here. So on the chart there, you've got 3 bars, and they're showing 3 different assessment timings, and they're showing the percent control. So what we see is that the initial knockdown, particularly from the Axial Pro treatments, is really, really good. Slightly less so with the Foxtrot. And then at the 3rd assessment timing in green, you can see that that percent control has dropped off. And that's because we saw regrowth of some of those wild oats. So although initial knockdown was good, we did see that they weren't fully killed and they started to grow back again. And this really highlights the importance of getting the right rate for the target that you have. Because it was so late and outside of the label recommendations, we're perhaps not seeing the performance from the 0.6 rate that we usually would when Axial Pro is used at the correct timing. And typically, if used at the right timing, we'd actually see the 0.6 performing more like the 0.8 rate is in this chart here. So I think it's really key that you can see that Axial Pro is performing at all rates better than the Foxtrot has, but it does also really highlight, as I said, the importance of getting the rate right for the weed that you're targeting in the crop. I think there's a couple of builds that are just going to show, yeah, that's the regrowth that we saw. And then the final thing, just because I wanted to cover this really quickly, is a reminder of the mixing and sequencing rules that come with Axial Pro. So it does have flexibility in being able to be tank mixed with things like fungicides and PGRs, and that can all be found on the tank mix list on our website. But also on the label, there are statements around mixing and sequencing with other herbicide products. And the important thing is to remember that if you use Axial Pro first in a sequence, then you need only wait 7 days before using any SU, ALS or hormone products. But if you use that SU, ALS inhibitor or hormone first, and you do need to wait 21 days before following with Axial Pro. So there's some real benefits to be seen there from targeting your wild oats early and then following up with that broadleaf weed control later. So there's some specifics in that mixing box there as well around which products, which is more specific than it has been in previous years. I don't expect you're necessarily going to remember that between now and spraying in season, but as I say, this information is all available. It's on the website and it's on the tank mix list as well. So that was everything from me.
Okay, so just to finish up today, we thought we'd run you through some of our trials that we did. A new idea from us, well, a new idea that we've tried out this year for the first time. And we were looking again at nitrogen, but also taking into account carbon footprinting and carbon emissions. So we're all very aware of the pressures that different people are feeling in terms of climate change and achieving net zero. So there's pressure from the general public on the end product, so the beer or the whiskey that they're consuming. They're starting to say that actually no, I want something that maybe is a bit more sustainable. there's pressure on the brewer, the maltster, to have the materials that they use be more sustainable. And as we're in a food chain, quite a lot of the times those pressures are ending up, or potentially going to end up, on the grower to produce the raw material in a more sustainable or potentially carbon neutral way. And so we started off by looking at the nitrogen impact of this. So this year we did a couple of trials. You might recognize some of these rates. We took 4 different rates, and we took 4 different sources of nitrogen, and we kind of reflected what you've seen previously in our brewing and malt distilling trials. So the rates ranged from 100 up to 175 kilos of N. And we chose 4 different types of nitrogen sources. And what we did was we changed the rate of product applied so that each product would apply 100 kilos of nitrogen, or 125 or 150 and 175. And the objective of the trials was to determine if yield, grain nitrogen and carbon footprint were affected either by the source of the nitrogen or the rate that was applied. Because as well as trying to be more sustainable, with malting barley, we still need to be able to produce the right grain nitrogen for the different markets, and also need to still produce a crop. The yield needs to be good enough to make this all economically viable as well. We use the Cool Farm tool, which is one of the available tools to look at carbon footprinting. And we did only look at one tool this time. In the future, we're hoping to look at different types of tools, because we know that they all calculate carbon footprinting in a slightly different way. But for this trial, we looked at the Cool Farm tool. And we had 4 locations. We had 2 in England and 2 in Scotland. The 2 sites in England used SY Tungsten, and the 2 sites in Scotland used Laureate. And the applications were split 50-50 in the seed bed and by early tillering. And one of the trials was conducted at Rougham, which some of you may have visited either this year or in previous years, COVID allowing. And so we had one of the trials there. And the applications were made on the 1st of April and the 12th of May. So just a little bit about the weather. It was an incredibly strange spring this year, as I'm sure you're all aware. If we look at the weather for Rougham, and because the application was made on the 1st of April, if you look at April, the chart on the left-hand side with the orange curve, that shows you the average temperature in the red line, and then the highs and the lows is the sort of the orange bars are the sort of surrounding the red line. And then the black line is what happened in 2021. So if you look at April, you can see that the temperature for April was actually the lowest it has ever been in the last 30 years. So incredibly, incredibly cold. And then if you look at the blue bar below, the black line again shows you the amount of rainfall in April, and then the range, which is normal for the last 30 years in the blue bars. And again, you can see that April is the lowest it has been for the last 30 years. So this will obviously have an impact on uptake of nitrogen, but it's just so you're aware that this is what this trial was had to deal with this year. Interestingly, the 2 trials in England both suffered a similar weather pattern, very, very cold and very, very wet. In Scotland, it was still cold and very cold and very dry. In Scotland, it was still cold and it was still drier, but it was more within the range that they've seen in the last 30 years. So you can see when the applications were made, application 1, 1st of April, and that was sort of in quite a dry period. And then application 2, Rory, our trialist, managed to find a dry spell in between sort of a fair amount of rain over that May period, but the temperatures remained cool in May as well. So what did we find? So from Rougham, we also had quite a bit of lodging late on. So what you can see is that the yield decreases as the rate increases, and that's more due to the lodging that we saw. So the higher rates increased lodging, and so generally the yields were lower. Other than that, we couldn't really determine a particular link between either the source of nitrogen that was applied. It didn't really follow a very clear pattern. And actually, compared to the other sites, all the sites did something different in terms of yield, and there was no real clear link about the source of nitrogen or the rate. If we look at the grain nitrogen, there was quite a clear pattern that in this trial, the CAN and the urease inhibitor trial generally had the higher grain N, and the AN and the urea generally had the lower grain N. What I will say is that this pattern was not seen on all of the other sites. However, what we did see on all sites was as you increased the rate, the grain nitrogen increased. So we can't really find a very, very clear link between the source of nitrogen and how that affects grain N, but we have seen a very, very clear link, and you've seen it previously in the nitrogen trials, that as you increase the rate in every situation, the grain nitrogen does increase. So when we then looked at carbon emissions, we saw a very, very clear pattern. As the rate increased, the carbon emissions increased on every type of nitrogen, and this happened in every single site across England and Scotland. We also saw a very clear pattern that stabilized urea had decreased CO2 emissions as well, and that was quite clear on all sites. CAN was generally lower than AN and urea, but that wasn't across the board, but in general, that was the trend that we saw. And it was this pattern was seen, and what you can see is the emissions per ton of barley. So this does take into account the yield. And this pattern was seen irrespective of yield, variety, weather, or soil type. So quite a clear pattern, which was really interesting to see. If you average those sites, then you can see that overall we had a decrease in carbon emissions by around 30 kilograms of CO2 per ton, where switching from urea to stabilized urea. Now that's the equivalent of about a 40-mile car journey. What the other thing that we can see is there's a huge impact of rate, and that's the green bars on the right-hand side. So reduction from 125 kilos to 100 kilos was 16 kilograms. Again, quite a significant reduction. I mean, if you look at the 175, which, as I've already said, is not really a sensible amount, particularly thinking of prices at the moment, but you can see a huge reduction just by tailoring rates that can get you quite low down. So if you then look at the next slide, Kip, interestingly, these 4 sites all had different soil types, and they also had a different change in management system. So the 2 Scottish sites were both plough-based, one of the sites was direct drill, and the Suffolk site was min-till. And the management change, in this particular tool, this is where it really takes into account carbon emissions and sequestration in terms of the soil being turned over. And so in this tool, management change had a huge impact on carbon footprinting. But we are aware that not everybody is going to be able to change their management systems easily. And not everyone is able to continually do one type. Sometimes you'll have to change depending on what the season throws at us. So it was interesting to see from these trials that although this management change did have a big impact, there are other ways that carbon footprinting can be altered. And what we're seeing as well is that actually that's not having a hugely detrimental effect on yield, and it is having an impact on grain nitrogen. It's something that we need to be aware of. So in conclusion, in terms of grain N and yield, we found that the different products behave differently on each soil type, on each site, and this was driven by soil type and weather conditions. But we found no clear pattern that the source of the N affects the grain N or the yield. We think it was more about uptake of those sources, and obviously that will depend on the different years and the different soil types that people have in their farms. The very clear was that increased rate of nitrogen increased the grain N, but there wasn't a clear pattern for yield. In terms of carbon emissions, we found that the change in the cultivation practice in the last 20 years had the biggest effect. However, very clear pattern that was independent of yield, variety, soil type, management system, and weather conditions was that we found that the rate had the big impact, and then that the source of N can impact the carbon emissions. We do have to be aware that for certain types of spring barley, we are looking to get high nitrogen, and rate is a very a good way of being able to get that high N. So we do just need to be aware that it's a bit of a toss-up between getting the specs needed for the maltsters in order to get the right market specifications, but as well as trying to potentially reduce carbon footprinting, which might become a requirement by some of these end users as well in the future. So that was a first look. We're hoping to, well, we are going to continue some of these trials in the future. You'll notice that I didn't have any prices on that as yet. Again, that is something that we will also look into in the future, particularly with nitrogen prices as they are at the moment. We're also looking at different cultivation methods. The picture on the right-hand side, you can see we've got a new drill that's sort of bridging the gap between small plot trials and farm machinery. And that enables us to do more trials looking at cultivation methods, cover cropping. We've got a couple of long-term sites in Suffolk and also in Scotland, as well as our long-standing sites that our sustainability team run, looking at rotation and different types of cultivation. And we've also got wildflower mixes, and we're looking at the beneficial insects. So we are really looking at lots of different concepts. From a variety point of view, we're looking at how our varieties perform, and we're also looking at sort of the bigger picture and how our seeds and CP products can fit into different ways of working.
Thanks, Kath. So we're getting close to the end now, so I thought it'd be just good just to have a quick summary of what we've discussed today. Obviously, Kath and Tracy went into the market and also looking at the varieties specifically and pull out things for me with Laureate. Obviously, it's continued performance across the seasons it's been available, and now with its large market share coupled with that reliability, I think is going to keep pushing Laureate to be a very favourable variety. Tungsten, again, it's one of the earliest varieties that we've got, and I think that comes with obvious benefits, particularly when trying to grow grain for quality, so getting it off early and also getting ground ready for following crops as well. But also that resistance to lodging that's built into tungsten is also quite useful. And then with Splendor, picking out that for grass weed suppression, this could be a good one for that spring slot. It's very high yielding as well, but coupled with that really high lodging and brackling resistance, if you're going to drive those crops to get that high yield with a bit of nitrogen, there's a bit of a safety net there with the built-in resistance to brackling and lodging. Kath also then just gave us a nice overview of some of the work we're doing around carbon, and obviously regen and net zero being quite a big focus at the moment. And I think particularly with spring barley or malting barley growers being close to that food chain, I think this sort of work is going to be vital potentially for future contracts, as Kath did say, that getting to that carbon neutrality is going to be quite key. And also quite interesting looking at how the nitrogen and the cultivations have a big factor on that. And then Georgie looked at PGRs and also we looked at fungicides, and just thinking about how key it is to adapt to those changes throughout the season, but also thinking about how those seasons can change from different years, that it's all about making sure you are putting the right products in at the beginning, because you don't know what's around the corner. So particularly with PGRs, don't sort of shy away too much, as who knows what's going to happen in the next following weeks after that early stage. And I think with that, really, it's all just left for us to say thank you for attending. There is a couple of questions. I think we've got time for 2 questions. One question was around axial and adjuvants, Georgie. What's our advice around adjuvants with axial?
So typically, if you're using the reduced rate of axial, so if you're going with the 0.4 rate, then we do see a benefit of topping up the adjuvant with Adjugor, because by reducing the rate, you are reducing the amount of built-in adjuvant you have. That 0.4 rate is only really appropriate if you're targeting small weeds in the early part of the season. So there we do see a benefit. More typically, when you're kind of using it later in the season to capture all of the emergence that you are going to get across the spring, the 0.6 rate is optimized with that built-in wetter formulation for that rate. So we don't see any benefit for wild oat control in adding extra adjuvant in there.
Hold on, thank you. I don't think we've really got any time left, but I'll make sure all the questions that came through will get answered. We'll send them on after this. So I think it's just left for us to say thanks for attending and Merry Christmas. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the new year, and hopefully, all being well, more face-to-face again. But that sounds like what we said last year. So hopefully this time it can happen. But thanks again. Thank you and bye-bye.